Yeah, so I'm just going to go over a quick little agenda that we have. So I'm going to be talking about PFAS in the state of Iowa today. So I'll talk briefly about what is PFAS. PFAS is the acronym. There are many different kinds of PFAS, but I'll talk about. I'll talk a little bit about our Iowa DNR action plan that we developed, our sampling that we've been doing since 2021. Then I will go in a little bit of the data that we have, where other monitoring that's being done around the state, which is with EPA. And then I will talk about the new EPA PFAS final rule that was recently published. And I will talk about funding for PFAS. What do we do when we find it? So that's a little bit about what I'm going to talk about. So I'll start off first, but what is PFAS? For those that don't know, it's per and polyfluoroalkyl substance, which is a mouthful. But there are many different kinds. There's really two different versions. There's PFOA, or those with the sulfonic acid, and PFOA, those with an A at the end, are the carboxylic acids. I won't go into a lot of the chemistry or details on that, but just know that there's two different branches, I guess, and there could be thousands of different variations. It's taken EPA, for example, 6 years to develop one PFAS regulation. It takes a chemist 15 minutes to develop a new kind of PFAS product. So I've heard there's up to 12,000 different varieties of PFAS out there. And I don't know if anybody really knows exactly, but PFAS have been produced for a very long time. I think the Manhattan Project back in the 40s was when it was first introduced, so it's been around a long time. But it's only been in the last 10 years that it's really been a focus. You may have heard about Teflon pans, 10 years or so ago. But anyway, what is PFAS? Just think non-stick products, oil repellent, water repellent, Scotch Guard, Gore-Tex, anything that repels water or is stain repellent. PFAS can be in your consumer products, anywhere from your sandwich wrappers, popcorn bags, pizza boxes, those types of things. So your cheese doesn't stick to your wrappers, those types of things. Also, firefighting foam has been a big use as well, to put out fires related to fuel, aircrafts, ships, those types of things. It works very well for what it was intended to do. And that's been one of the large sources of PFAS and some of the contamination from military installations or airport facilities around the country. But anyway, so that's kind of in general, what is PFAS when we talk about PFAS is kind of a general term, but there are many different kinds. And I'll talk about a few of those that EPA has recently released for their final rule, which is a maximum contaminant level. In the past, we've been dealing with health advisories that EPA has changed a few times over the years as they've learned more information. Lots of research being done with PFAS across the country and has been for quite some time. Next, I will move on to what is the Iowa DNR doing and what was our action plan. So back in 2020, we put together an action plan for the state of Iowa, which really had three parts to it. First was monitoring. Well, what do we have in the state of Iowa? Second part was pollution prevention, or what things can we do to reduce that amount? And then third was education. What can we do to get information out there in the state? So I'll focus mainly on the first one. And we're still dealing with all these items and continuing to in our action plan. But the first one was really sampling, monitoring. What do we have in the state of Iowa? So once we developed our action plan back in 2020, as I said, it was a crazy time, as everybody knows, in 2020, what was going on. So we actually didn't start sampling until 21. Was when we first got our sampling started. And so the approach that we used in the state of Iowa was to identify potential PFAS locations around the state. So we looked at public information databases from EPA based on the industrial classification code system, basically users of PFAS. That would be, airports, landfills, any manufacturer that may have had any potential involvement. It didn't mean they used PFAS or manufactured it, but they could have been a potential user. So we had a list of about 1,200 facilities around the state that we looked at, including the airports, military installations, landfills, public-owned treatment works or wastewater facilities, and those industrial sources around the state. So those 1,200 locations, and then we threw that on a map and looked at how close public water supplies or wells were in your communities, and Davenport was one of those. And so we started a sampling approach based on the location, and then the well vulnerability. Was it a deep well, a shallow well? What did we know about the well? So how close was the well to the potential locations, and how vulnerable was that well? And so we started our approach that way. We looked at the worst case scenarios that we thought of or knew of at first, and that's kind of where we started. So we had this different tier approach. So tier 1, 2, 3, 4. Now we're on tier 5. That doesn't really mean anything. It's just that we selected it. We do about 50 each time. We redid some as well. And so to date, we've sampled about 152 water supplies around the state, which is about 65% of the population of the state of Iowa. So all the large communities in the state of Iowa. And if you take a look, and I'll talk about that a little bit later, we have an Iowa DNR dashboard, PFAS dashboard. Just Google Iowa DNR PFAS dashboard and you'll find it. We also have a website as well to help educate the public on PFAS and link to other useful resources, which was all part of our action plan, that third part of our action plan. And that information is out there on our website. But anyway, as far as the sampling that we've done, 152 water supplies, as I mentioned. We had about 90 that had no detection of any PFAS. 60 of those had or roughly 40% of them had a detection of at least one PFAS. 25 of those detections, we had considered a health advisory based on EPA's numbers that they had provided at that time, which was 70 parts per trillion. A part per trillion is very small. Think of one drop of water in 20 Olympic-sized swimming pools. So very small amounts. But that toxicity is a different issue as well. So it doesn't take much to have an issue, which EPA is continuing to study and get more and more information on as people learn more about PFAS. So that was about 16%. So those 25 that did have a health advisory was about 16% of those that we sampled. And then 12 had amounts above the finished water, which required public notification. That's what, since there wasn't a specific rule on PFAS, it would be considered an emerging contaminant. And so that's how we couldn't, there was no maximum contaminant level. So there was no treatment required, but the only thing we have in our rules or the authority that we had was to require public notification. So that was 7% of those that we sampled as well. And so that's kind of what we've done to date. We are continuing to, we are actually just starting our 5th round of sampling, which was another 37 water supplies around the state that we are now contracting. We did a lot of the sampling at first in-house with our own staff. Now we're working with the state hygienic laboratory to do that sampling for us. And we're just starting here in the month of May for another 37 water supplies around the state. And our focus on this round is smaller water systems, which I'll go into more detail on why we're just focusing on smaller water supplies at this point. And those that are close to, a water source or like a river or a stream or alluvial wells, those that are along streams and that may have some potential PFAS contamination. So just moving on. So that's a little bit about our sampling approach that we've been utilizing since 2021. And I did make mention of it. If you want to Google the Iowa DNR PFAS dashboard, you can go out and see that information. We have a state of Iowa map. Currently that map, we have some red, orange, and green dots on the map. That was all based on health advisory information. We now have MCL, so we're in the process of modifying our dashboard to reflect the new rule that EPA just published in the Federal Register on April 26th, which will be effective June 25th is when that rule actually goes into effect, 60 days after publication. So we will have our website updated with the dashboard to reflect the new numbers. So the numbers that you see on the dashboard, if you take a look at that, you'll see 15 red dots on there. Those are based on the health advisory. So those numbers will change and the numbers will fluctuate. I mean, it's a living document. Every quarter we get new results in and those will be reflected in our dashboard. There's really two ways to get to that information. You can look at it on the dashboard, or you can also look at it if you just Google Iowa DNR drinking water data portal. You can look at all the results across the state of Iowa for any community, and you can download the PFAS data in an Excel format and look at that as well. So we have a dashboard and you can click on your community and see what the results are, the most recent round, and or get to a PDF document where you can see all the results for your community on PFAS, or you can go to our portal and download it there as well. So a couple of different options to get the PFAS data in the state of Iowa and or your community. So as far as that, so that's a little bit about the data, the sampling that we've done, the data that we have available for everybody. I've talked a little bit about the different tiers of sampling that we've done. And so now I'll move on to what sampling is being done by EPA. So they are completing their UCMR 5 sampling, which stands for Unregulated Contaminant Monitoring Rule. It's their 5th round. Part of that sampling was focused on PFAS. So EPA is sampling all public water supplies in the state, with a population of 3,300 and larger. And that's from 2023 through 2025. And they're also doing a few smaller facilities. So that sampling has been going on for a little over a year now. And they will continue to do that sampling. So that's where we're focused on some of those smaller systems below 3,300 at this point as well. And so as we continue to get all that information in from EPA, we put that on our website as well, and it's available. EPA will have that information available as well. So moving on to EPA's rule related to PFAS that they just published in April. They have set a maximum contaminant level. Before we just dealt with a health advisory, and 70 parts per trillion was that number. And then actually they lowered that, I don't remember the exact timeline, to really near zero, like 0.004 and 0.002 parts per trillion, which was super low. That health advisory was not that was just based on health and not cost or feasibility. And so labs can't even test that low. So this new MCL that EPA published is based on, laboratory capability. Can they test that low? And so, and what's the cost to treat? Can a community afford to treat for PFAS? That's part of what drives these maximum contaminant levels. Is it what it's based on health, it's based on cost and feasibility. And that's where EPA came up with 4 parts per trillion for PFOA and PFOS. And then they have PFNA at 10 parts per trillion, PFHXS at 10 parts per trillion, and GenX, which is a PHF, or correction, sorry, this is kind of like alphabet soup, but PFPO-DA is what the GenX is. And then they have one additional count on PFBS, which all 4 of those last 4 are included in hazard index. I don't want to get, it's kind of confusing, but there's an equation where they consider the mixture of chemicals. Those last 4 that I mentioned can also be included in a calculation to determine this hazard index level of 1. And there's a long calculation that goes along with that. that is also part of this rule. So EPA did release the maximum contaminant goals, which is in addition to the MCL. The goals is 0 for PFOA and PFOS, and it's the same for those other compounds, 10, 10, 10. For those other compounds that I listed. But as far as what's enforceable and once the rule goes into effect is the 4 parts per trillion. And that really is based on laboratory capability. It's difficult for labs to get much below that. Some can get down to 2 parts per trillion, which EPA will utilize that number for some monitoring as well. But just to give you an idea when this rule takes effect, water systems will now have 3 years to conduct their initial monitoring, which we already have some of that information available. So we'll be utilizing that information. And then after 2027, then water systems will start to work on their treatment or implement their treatment. And by 5 years out or 2029, then they'll have to have meeting that PFAS MCL requirement in their public drinking water system. So EPA gave water systems 5 years to implement this rule, and we will continue to work with those systems between now and then to accomplish that. Some are already meeting the new limit. As far as we've had a number of systems across the state of Iowa take wells offline, and just the knowledge that they learn from sampling. I know Davenport has done a sampling for a significant amount of times, and they were probably one of the early communities in the state to sample, even since they were sampling probably 4 or 5 years before we even started our sampling. So that's been good news. They've been watching these levels, and back then they were below the 70 parts per trillion. At that time, back in 2017, when they first started their sampling. But anyway, that's a little bit about the new MCL or rule that EPA recently released. So we're actually working on the planning part of that right now, and have a team together where we will incorporate this information from EPA in our own rules and work over the next few years to get that published in our state of Iowa rules. But we can implement this based on what EPA has already published. So that's what we will be doing over the next couple of years. So just moving on for the last piece, and that's funding in the state of Iowa. Now that we have this new rule, what can we do about it? And the last piece, we have our state of Iowa revolving fund, which is a loan program that we have had for many years, since the 1996 amendments of the Safe Drinking Water Act, when that program was established. So we get, in general, about $17 million a year, but we also have gotten new money from the bipartisan infrastructure law, and that has given us some new pots of money that I'll talk about here from FY22 through FY26. I'm going to take a drink of water. I'm getting a little bit of a dry throat. Sorry about that. So some of these new pots of funding that can be utilized for this rule. We have, I'll list the pots of funding and I'll talk about some, but not all of them. We have the new bill general supplemental funding, which is going to be $174 million, with $85 million of that being loan forgiveness, or 49% of that will be forgivable loans for communities that apply for this infrastructure funding. Then we have a specific pot of funding called the emerging contaminant funding, which will be specifically for PFAS, but it could be other emerging contaminants as well, where we have $57 million over those 5 years, and that's going to be at 100% loan forgiveness. So if a community has a treatment that they need to put in for PFAS, there is funding available for that, and that is at 100% loan forgiveness. Of course, we have equations, we can't give it all out. And so we have some information in what we call our intended use plan, our SRF intended use plan, that has the criteria that communities can use to determine what they would be subject to for that funding or available for them to utilize for this funding. And then the last pot of money we have, and that's specific to lead service line replacement funding, which I won't talk to at all. So anyway, we do have one other source of funding outside of this bipartisan infrastructure funding in the SRF program, and that's through a different grant program that we are working with EPA as well to apply for that funding. And that's called the Emerging Contaminant Small Disadvantaged Community Grant, where we'll have an additional $47 million in a grant program that can be also utilized for PFAS projects. We will also do some of the things that I mentioned in our action plan as far as pollution prevention that we will also utilize some of that funding for. And one of those, we are looking at doing a take back program to take back the firefighting foam that exists out there in the state of Iowa at communities, at your fire stations. They may have this foam on hand that is expired or out of date, or there are new versions of foam that are safer than the old versions. And so we're looking at getting that back so that it's not used for fires and put into the environment. So that's part of that pollution prevention program that I mentioned. We want to do a take back program for some of this old AFFF, and that's just aqueous foam. I may get this wrong. Basically, it's firefighting foam is the easy way to say that. And so that's kind of the funding piece that we have available in the state of Iowa to help us implement this new MCL that EPA has recently published. So I haven't been watching the chat to see if there are any questions. No, I don't see any questions in there. But Bill, if people want to raise their hand, they can do so. If we want to take questions that way, or if people have questions in the chat, I can certainly respond to it that way. But that's a quick overview of what we've done in the state of Iowa for PFAS and kind of where we're going here in the near future with our rulemaking and how we plan to implement this. But we'll keep sampling between now and then, and you know, over the next 3 years. And then we will be putting this information in our water supply operations permits, which will have the monitoring requirements that's where we include these requirements currently to do the PFAS sampling that we have. Once we go out and sample and identify that a community has PFAS, that's where we put the quarterly monitoring requirements for PFAS or other. That's the way we work. That's how we put the requirements for any monitoring for water systems in the state of Iowa. So are there any questions at this time related to PFAS to your community specifically? I am not seeing any. Oh no, there's one. Okay. Can you talk about industry responsible to reduce, eliminate point source discharges or pre-treat? And what about the financial liability? Yes, I can hit on that. One thing that EPA has been really pushing with their plan as well is to hold producers accountable for those that manufacture the PFAS. There's, you know, lots of, I think at one time I heard there's 6,000 different lawsuits out there related to PFAS. And so that's one route that, and there's some multi-district litigation going on related to PFAS. We don't really offer legal advice on those, on that litigation, you know, but communities can certainly pursue those options. There is a number of different, you know, settlements that they're working on, and I'm not an expert in that area by any means, that communities may see some of that funding for their local community if they have PFAS. But as far as drinking water has been the lead, I would say, in PFAS actions in the state and really across the country. As far as discharges, Our NPDS program is working on a plan as well, but some of the challenges is monitoring and getting laboratories that are capable to detect that, and as far as the methods that we utilize, drinking water does have 2 approved methods for regulatory purposes that we can sample. And that took quite some time for EPA to develop those methods. They are now here recently, they have finalized the method for wastewater. So that was one of the hurdles to get across. There are some states that are starting to put limits in the NPDES program, which is the National Pollution Elimination Discharge System. I may have gotten that slightly wrong, but that's what the permit, similar to our operation permit in drinking water, that's the operation permit on the wastewater side as well. So there are some states around the country that are doing this, but it's still early. EPA has a memo related to this, or guidance that is encouraging sampling for wastewater or for waste or industrial facilities. That still has a long ways to go, but like I said, drinking water has been the lead. There's a lot more work that's been done, but as they learn more information, and as people sample, you don't know what you have for issues until you actually sample. And so, what we saw a lot of with the drinking water facilities is once people know they have it, then they can do something about it. And we had a lot of communities take wells offline or do what they could to blend water, take the high well, use the well that is higher in PFAS only for emergency basis and things like that. So that would, voluntary compliance would also work, I'm sure, on the wastewater side as well. But that program is still ramping up, as well as many other programs related to PFAS, whether it's air quality, fish tissue, or landfills. There's a lot. Biosolids is another one. There's a lot of work that still has to be done on PFAS, but drinking water is well ahead of the other programs in the state and around the country. And what about financial liability? That's not my area of expertise by any means. I would say talk to your city attorney, and they can help walk you through that, or any professional association that your community is a member of. Reach out to their attorneys and they can help you with that liability and the litigation that is occurring there. So I hope I answered your question on that. And we I would say in the future, we will be doing more of the, working more with the industries to include the PFAS in their monitoring requirements. And that would be spelled out in our NPDES permits. And we have a draft protocol related to that.